All right, today in our next video in our seller series, we're going to talk about home inspection, specifically a pre-sale inspection. What is a pre-sale inspection? We're going to get right into that. Before we do, if you're not already a subscriber, if you don't mind subscribing or tapping that bell to be notified of videos like this when they become available. So a pre-sale inspection is essentially a home inspection that's conducted by a seller before they put their house on the market. In a typical transaction, a buyer would conduct an inspection. That would be part of their offer, part of the terms, and they do that at their cost and on their time. A pre-sale inspection is one that's conducted by the seller, usually before going on the market. And honestly, usually it's recommended by the selling agent. I'm not a big fan of that. I feel that a lot of times that is recommended by the agent, it's part of a larger thing. The seller and the agent may not be on the same page in terms of pricing, and so sometimes the seller will recommend a pre-sale inspection, just to have the seller have an idea of the types of things that may come up at an inspection, maybe use that as leverage to get them to be a little bit more flexible on their price. I'm not a big fan of pre-sale inspections for several reasons, so I usually recommend against them. If it's been mentioned to one of my sellers as something they may want to do, sometimes by another agent. And there are many reasons why I'm not a big fan of it. The first is it's entirely possible that your buyer doesn't have an inspection, right? If you go on the market and you have 5 offers or 10 offers, it's possible or even likely that the buyer, some buyers may make an offer without an inspection. And you can consider that as part of the overall offer terms. So you might have spent the time and the money to have an inspection, and your buyer was not going to have one anyway. So you've kind of created a problem that never existed. The other reason is you also have an obligation as a seller to disclose a known material defect. So you as a homeowner, this is a conversation I have with all of my sellers. Is there anything on the house that's not working that you're aware of that we would need to disclose? So for example, if you know that your exterior lights don't work, they haven't worked in the last 5 years, that's something you would disclose. Or if there's a sink in your basement that's leaking, you know not to use it, but you would have to disclose that to a buyer. Right? But you're not required to know everything about your house. In like all likelihood, you don't. If an inspector comes in 3 or 4 hours, tears everything apart, they may find things that you were not aware of. Now, if you've had that inspection, now you're aware of them. If you do not address it, that is something that you would need to disclose to a buyer. So now you might be creating either repairs or disclosures for yourself that there would not be before. Also, what may come up at an inspection may not have been a trigger point for a buyer, right? So if you've got a deck and the decking is a little older, maybe a little splinter and needs a little bit of TLC, that might be something that comes up at your inspection, but maybe your buyer, or who would ultimately be the buyer for your house, was planning on redoing the deck. They were going to enlarge it. They were going to go to composite. They're a handy guy or handy girl, and they're comfortable doing that themselves. So now you've kind of created an issue that never existed. Another reason why I don't recommend them is that every inspector is different. They all have their own backgrounds, their own expertise, and so one may come up with something at an inspection that another one might not. I've had 4 inspections on the same house, and for different reasons a deal would fall through, and it's uncanny. Every inspector came up with different things in their inspection, and often things that came up at one inspection didn't come up at the next, and vice versa. So in that case, you as a seller might have said, hey, I spent all this money on this inspection, I corrected several things, and now the buyer is having their inspection and they want me to fix X and Y, or these other issues came up, but they didn't come up at mine, so I don't want to fix them. And now you've sort of in your own mind created a barrier to working through if there are legitimate problems at the inspection. So for several reasons, I generally do not advise the seller to have a pre-sale inspection. Obviously, if there's anything on the house that you're not aware of, we would suggest to address that. Staging or preparation to the house to spiff it up for a sale, of course, but probably not to take that next step to hire an inspector to go through your house to create an inspection that may create problems for you down the road in a couple of different ways. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you on the next video.